Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk.
Well, even if you have half an eye and half an ear on the news these days, you're hearing the phrases defund the police or even disband the police. On the face of it, doesn't make a lot of sense. But to find out more, Anil Anand is on the other screen. He's a retired police inspector. He's written a book called Mending Broken Fences Policing. He's rewriting that book and incorporating some information about this defund the police movement. So he's the ideal person to give us a perspective on this. Welcome back, Anil.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Now let's get past the buzz phrase mending broken fences policing, because broken fences policing, I think, is that thing that emanated from Rudy Giuliani when he was mayor of New York, that if you look after the garbage, the graffiti, the broken windows, you're going to solve a lot bigger crimes. Explain your position on that, please.
Yeah, actually, it started with George Keeling. George Keeling had said that broken windows is this concept of looking at the smaller issues in society. So when you go to communities, if you see graffiti, broken windows, derelict cars, that those things are indicators of deeper social issues. Well, of course, the police took it over and used that as a strategy for responding to crime and disorder, which led to CompStat in New York. And that's became called the broken windows policing model, which is really wrong. Because, and the difference was this, when George Keeling was talking about mending broken fences or broken windows, he was talking about trying to find out what the antecedents of crime were and then trying to mitigate those issues so that we could then prevent larger problems. Well, the police took the same model and applied it to just crime, not the housing and poverty and everything else that George Keeling was talking about. He meant crime as well. But
now, who is this person you're speaking of?
George Keeling was a professor who coined the term broken windows policing. Broken windows. And of course, Bratton and the New York Police Department took it on as a strategy for responding to crime in New York.
So I think I'm hearing you saying that the professor's approach was to say, why are people in such a state that they want to vandalize or break things or engage in minor offenses, try to get to the root cause of that?
Yeah, he was on record. He was pretty clear to say, look, we need to look at housing, poverty, all of the other social issues that lead to crime and disorder, and to those things that lead to crime. So we need to address crime as well. So policing took that one component and applied it to CompStat and policing. So, you know, the big famous example that you and I have spoken about is the turnstile jumpers in New York. So if you stop the turnstile jumpers and the graffiti, you prevent, you know, robberies and purse thefts, snatches and everything else. Then that was sort of the police approach to things. The question that policing missed, that Keeling would have asked was, why is that guy jumping the turnstile? What causes him to jump the turnstile? Which is what policing didn't do.
Well, and then it may be a very simplistic view, but I've spent a lot of time in New York, and turnstile jumping and broken windows and litter and graffiti are the least of their problems there, it seems to me. And that kind of opens up the police to the old cliche, why aren't you catching the real criminals or organized criminals? What are you bugging me for but a broken taillight?
Yeah, so that causes this, larger issues. The policing is the only 24/7, 365-day public service there to respond to just about anything that happens in society. The first thing you think about is calling the police, whether it's a neighbor dispute or a break and enter, whatever else it is. The problem that we've now ended up with is that marginalized communities are saying, hey, we're being over-policed. And there's a militarization of that policing. And those of us live in the type of neighborhoods that you and I live in, and you and I have talked about this, you've had the same issues. We complain that the police don't pay enough attention to our issues that are important to us. So if I have thefts on my car in the driveway and I call in, I'll get a call back 2 days later telling me that I should install a security camera and, lock the door and stuff like that. So both spectrums are now in the position where they're sort of unsatisfied. You and I are saying that we're paying $1,200,000 to the Toronto Police Service, for example, and is this the best service that I can get for my $1 billion? And marginalized communities are saying, hey, what's going on? How come we've got so many of our people in jails and prisons?
Well, the old cliche, what's a billion? pretty soon you're talking about real money. You start racking up the billions. I don't know how I would judge that. But let's get into the precursor of this discussion about defund the police. I'm sure you would agree that there is a serious problem here, that there aren't tens of thousands of people on the street protesting about nothing. That from Rodney King on in Los Angeles, where the beating was on video, I was teaching at the Canadian Police College at that time, and we kind of thought that that was going to be the end of that sort of thing because everything you did was on video. But there seem to be many officers who just keep doing this kind of thing, feeling that they're immune to prosecution. What do you say about that?
Well, this is the trap that people fall into. Now, we'll start talking about Rodney King and George Floyd. The issue is not Rodney King and George Floyd. Clearly, the officers that conducted in this in those incidents or involved in those incidents are criminals. They did things that we all recognize was wrong. This is clear and cut misconduct, and they need to be addressed that way. But this movement that's taking place, the defunding movement, is not about George Floyd. George Floyd is the catalyst to this, but it's about a whole bunch of other issues. I mean, when the police are trying to arrest as use force, contrary to Robert Peel's principles, and end up killing a guy for a $20 bill, there's something wrong with that.
Well, let me just say, and I can't believe I'm on the other side of this issue for a moment with you, but if the lawyers joke that if you want to know what didn't happen, ask 10 eyewitnesses, because they're notoriously unreliable. And even video and still pictures are not admissible in many court cases because they're subject to editing and framing and cropping and this, that, and the other. However, on the face of it, I take your comments at face value. So this has been a catalyst. And just before we get into the defund the police movement, is there a solution? Because some people say we need more oversight. But my goodness, there's oversight over the oversight with police, with the commission and the mayor and the city council and the courts and the rules of evidence, which often favor the police. You can't bring in prior officers' conduct into a court case. What do you say about the solution? Could it possibly be oversight, or is there something else?
Well, there's no easy answers to this. Police have been grappling with this for decades. We went from community-based policing to neighborhood policing to CPLCs, community police liaison committees. We've done all of this stuff. It hasn't worked. When crime was up, we increased police funding. We militarized the police. We tried zero tolerance policing. We created units like the DEA. There was a war on crime. It didn't work. When crime was down in the 80s, we were doing the same sort of stuff, and it didn't work. Police funding went up, and it hasn't worked. The problem is the answers that we've looked for these things, in my opinion, have been very simplistic. So now the new buzzwords you're hitting out of New York is precision policing. Now what that means baffles me. Is that different from targeted policing? Is it different from intelligence policing, from hot zone policing? What does that mean, precision policing?
Well, I was going to jump in there when you said community-based policing, because that has been the buzz phrase for at least 30 years, and there's no definition of it. Everybody talks about it, but it could be cops on bicycles, on scooters, walking around, one in a car, two in a car. It could be absolutely anything. Now, you also have an MBA, and business is susceptible to these buzzwords that don't mean anything or that change on a quarterly basis. Management by results, management by objectives, all this sort of stuff. So the police are not immune to the sort of busy work and bureaucracy that spins wheels that we have in other sectors of society, right?
Sure. I mean, there's a self-sustaining ethic in almost any industry, and there's a very powerful self-sustaining ethic in policing. There is no politician that wants to defund the policing outright because it is political suicide. Tough on crime is sexy. It always has been. You don't see contemporary shows on neighborhood policing. There was only one in about 40 years, a police show that was based on community-based policing. It was called The Blue Knight, with an actor called Kennedy. That was the only one. You've had Miami Vice, the Mod Squad, you've got Adam 12, you've got CSI now, and these all are a reflection of the eras in policing that we've lived in. But we've never seen the popularization of community-based policing.
Well,
Really,
Anil, you're dating yourself with the Mod Squad. I may be the only person who remembers that, but so be it. There's one more solution that I'd like your reaction to, and that is liability insurance. There's at least one academic study that says if a police officer, such as some of the ones who've been in the news, who had like more complaints than 90% of all the officers on that force and had been to court before, if they had to get liability insurance, they would be priced out of that market, just like a bad driver would be priced out of the driving market. What do you say about that?
well, look, I think it's a novel idea. I don't know how it would fit into policing because it's such a high risk profession. I mean, when you're sending somebody out carrying a firearm and a taser and a baton and, you know, body worn cameras and all this equipment, I don't know how insurance companies are going to assess that risk. It's a novel idea. I think the answer is, you know, good training. And I don't mean just promotional training. A lot of our training that we do takes up a lot of time, a lot of money, and it's a cover your ass type of, pardon the expression, but it really is a cover your ass sort of approach to policing. And if I can just tell you why, you know, we are so big, policing has become so good at mitigating risk because of liability and oversight that we've become very good at hiding our mistakes or becoming increasingly proficient at finding mistakes. So officers become really good at avoiding detection until it's too late. And so there are cultural changes that we need to make. Liability creates avoidance motivation. Officers will learn to hide and do what they need to do, think that they need to do outside of sight. They'll do what they need to do to get the approach motivation, to get rewarded and promoted when they're in view, but they don't want to get caught. And supervisors are seen as the enemy because they're there to find you making the mistake.
Powerful thoughts. Would you say, and I wonder if it was you who told me in a private conversation, that two officers in a car are actually often more dangerous, in more danger than one, because with two, you know you have backup right there and you'll be a little more adventurous?
You know, I don't know what the studies are. I think psychologically, perhaps, I know when I was working, I was more ready to respond to something because I had a partner with me, especially a high-risk call. You took it on to yourself over somebody that was in the one-man car. So you may not take the time and create the distance to think things through as you might if you were in a one-man car. Yeah, I'm not sure how that plays into this, but I mean, I think we have to look at least, you know, that our issues are very different in Canada than they are in the United States. Clearly, when you stop somebody and you want to, I mean, if you stop somebody that's maybe used a fraudulent $20 bill, you know who he is. He's on video camera. You know what car he's getting into. Is it really necessary to employ all that force to arrest him and, you know, possibly hurt him or yourself at that point? Why not just take out a warrant and go and pick him up later on? Same thing with impaired drivers. Same thing with a bunch of other things that we can do, depending on the risk, of course, right? You don't have to affect a risk when you find that person committing then. So, I mean, we have to look at how we do policing.
All right, well, let's get into the defund issue via a little wee bit of ancient humor. Around the time when the Mod Squad was on TV, there was a bumper sticker that said, if you don't like the police, next time you're in trouble, call a hippie. Now that bumper sticker was around probably when you had hair about down to your shoulders and you were undercover, and I had a lot of hair as well, both of us at least looking like hippies. And in fairness, there was not particularly any reason for conflict between young people and the police in those days. But the serious point, I think, to that quip is that what would be the alternative? I mean, are people who are talking about disbanding the police really talking about a city with no police in it? Because when there's a strike, you've seen it on TV, drag races down the main street because the police are on strike. So could this possibly be a serious and workable idea?
No, I mean, I think eliminating policing is just plain and simple ludicrous. We can't have that. You need to have policing. Policing is not just about frontline contact, the type of contact that you and I would experience on a daily basis. It's about dealing with organized crime. It's about dealing with human smuggling and pedophiles and bank robbers and sexual assaults. So there's a lot of other things that police deal with on a daily basis. It's not just sort of traffic stops and crowd management issues. So getting rid of policing is simply, I think, a non-starter. It's just, you know, not going to happen.
Well,
But
you'd have to invent something else that you didn't call the police. For example, in Costa Rica, they have no military, but they have the largest police force per capita in the world. So something would fill the void, I assume.
Sure, Sir Robert Peel's principle was the police are the public and the public are the police. And if the public embrace and accept the normative values of laws and live by them, you don't need any policing. But we don't live, and we will never live in that society, because we will always have the non-compliance, we'll have the misfits. So that's just not going to happen. But yeah, we can.
And yet, everything you've said so far leads me to believe that you have seen waste and inefficiency and mismanagement and buzzwords and activity traps and busy work, and you might have a soft spot for some measure of defunding.
Look, I'm a proud police officer, and think there are things about policing that the public simply don't understand, simply because of the oath of secrecy, the way our adversarial system works, the information that comes out through different processes or procedures in a legal hearing. So people don't understand the complexity of policing and tend to make very simplistic decisions. But yes, there are places where we can cut back. I mean, this whole thing about the fourth quarter dump, which I call the fourth quarter dump, it's systemic in every organization. But in policing, you've got the fourth quarter where you get this budget. And if you don't need it, you've got to spend it. And I have seen Sally ports full of paper and water bottles simply because that money needed to be spent at the end of that fourth quarter.
That's endemic in the public sector. I'm sure the private sector does foolish things with their budgets as well.
It does, but when we're talking about systemic issues, I mean, we're not talking about George Floyd. The public wants to see a change in policing. And these are the type of systemic issues that people that are living in poverty and can't afford the next meal or pay for it, but then see a Sally port full of newspaper and bottles, or paper and bottles, that is a concern. And I think as a society, we need to look at that. We need to look at the fact that we had 75 officers in Toronto that made more than John Tory last year. You've got to look at the fact that the chief of police in Toronto made twice as much as John Tory. So does the public, does the taxpayer, who makes far less than you and I and lives in far worse off conditions than you and I, and know that their children will likely do too, have a legitimate concern to say, look, something is wrong with the way you guys are running the system? I think that there might be something to look at there.
Now, you've raised an interesting issue in your writing, which I've read, and that is when crime goes down, budgets go up. When crime goes up, budgets go down. Budgets go up. When crime stays the same, budgets go up. So in other words, no matter what happens, police budgets go up. And I have spoken privately to politicians who say, you know, the fire department and the police department just have us over a barrel, and they can drive the city bankrupt with impunity, but they want their raise. And there's no point in trying to argue against it in public. They got all the cards.
100%. And police associations are equally strong. And I mean, chiefs are reluctant to take on police associations. So salary negotiations and benefit negotiations cost us a great deal of money. I think there's room to look at that. And I think there's this thing about, you know, transparency is not accountability to me. And I think where it plays in really well in policing is when you look at chiefs of police, they get signed on a 5-year contract, say, they get that golden handshake. Whether crime goes up or down, whatever happens, they're there for 5 years. They're going to make twice as much as the mayor of Toronto is going to make. Where's the accountability? They can give you all the transparency. They can tell you the numbers. They can do all of the sort of, you know, the stuff we see on their website. But where is the accountability? Why did crime go up? What sort of capacity did you build in your police service and your officers when crime was down to prepare them for the times when things were going to be bad? What did you do? So transparency is not accountability.
Well, transparency is one of those buzzwords these days. All it means in the Oxford Dictionary is visible with a light behind. It could be dastardly, illegal, incompetent, horrible, disgusting, but if it can be seen, it's transparency. So you're right. You've written about something else as well, and that is how busy police officers really are. You said much earlier in this conversation that people call the police whenever they have a problem, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But how many calls does the average officer take? How many visits to a crime scene do they make? How busy are the average officers?
Yeah, it does. So that's both a legitimate and illegitimate observation that I make. It's legitimate for the reason that statistically, if you look at how many arrests an officer makes, how many charges they file through the year, and how many of those actually get convicted, the numbers would be surprisingly low. And if you ask the question, how many radio calls did you respond to in the last shift, and how many occurrences did you file, the numbers would be pretty small. But the counter to that is that, police officers are like firefighters. They can't sit at home while watching TV and they get called out when you need them, when the fire starts. You need them available when things happen. So you've got these officers patrolling and they're out there doing other stuff, which is really the bulk of time. But we need to figure out what is it that these officers are doing and what impact does that time have on their attitude to policing, to the neighborhood that they're in? What are they actually doing? If you're sitting in a parking lot, door to door and having a discussion about, the war stories you have, it has a cultural impact. If you're out there using that time to engage with the public, in a normative way that's, that community wants, it might have a different impact. So we need to look at the qualitative performance of our officers, not just the quantitative performance, not just the amount of homicides and break-and enters and auto theft. We need to look at, there are times when qualitative performance becomes very important.
All right, top 3 places to defund aspects of policing or reduce police budgets, if you please.
Fourth quarter, number 1. Number 2, training. There's a lot of time that officers spend off the road on sort of this tokenistic promotional training, which is click the button, listen to the next video, click the button, the next video. Every officer does that year after year. A complete waste of time. Performance evaluations, reward and punishments. So much time and effort is spent in police performance evaluations, which really amounts to nothing other than when the senior officer decides, I want to promote this guy, he gets a 10 out of 10 and off he goes. We need to look at that part of it. And we need to look at how we assign our officers. We need to look at schedules and shift changes, and this has been something that's been going on for as long as I was a police officer, and we've never been able to reconcile that. The most efficient way of deploying our officers.
Okay, so lots of room for tightening up the bureaucracy, let's say, and in all of the public sector, in that fourth quarter, be able to carry your money forward or something so that you aren't forced to spend it frivolously. Anil, not telling tales out of school, but some years ago you arranged for me to have a ride along with a staff sergeant, and it was great. Wore a bulletproof vest and went through some of the roughest neighborhoods of Toronto, and very active shift, busy all the time. Except I would probably say, without much hyperbole, no actual police work was done. The first call was about a obviously distraught woman naked on the railway tracks. The staff sergeant attended and saw 2 or 3 other officers involved. We moved along, went here, there, and everywhere. Occasionally someone asked the officer something. Walked through a particular park, saw a woman probably on drugs. Officer gave her a bit of counseling, made sure she was okay. Then parked his car and pulled out a notebook and a pencil, and I couldn't believe was writing out the details of what happened. I said, why don't you dictate that? He said, well, I don't know, we have a tradition. We just write this out and keep these notebooks forever in case there's a further incident, which sounds good, but you could mechanize that. I mean, my long-winded point is most of those calls probably should have been made by mental health professionals, perhaps with police backup in case there were some violence. What do you say about that?
Well, policing is very unpredictable. So you can go out there one day and be, run nonstop. And this is after saying that police aren't always busy. And you may have other times that they're, you're not busy. It depends on the time of day, the location. It depends on a lot of things. I think if you walk into a hospital emergency, they'll tell you that on a full moon night, it gets, inordinately busy. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen on a given night. It might have been just that evening that you were out on. But, the note-taking part's important. I mean, a great deal of an officer's time is spent on risk management. And not risk about the incident itself, the risk of liability of what's going to happen, the officer's notes, the reports, the stopping to take the time. And so there's a liability phobia in policing that leads to a lot of waste of time as well, because it's to cover your ass thing in case something goes wrong, in case I miss something, right? I need to write this down and be able to say, well, this is what I did because this is my liability.
Yeah, all I was saying was maybe you could dictate it a little more quickly. Here's another thought. A lot of police stops deal with something really mundane, broken taillight, turning, the wrong way on a street, and a whole, sometimes there are even two officers attending to this sort of thing. Wouldn't cameras where the owner of the vehicle is responsible, you lend it to someone who's irresponsible, you get the ticket, tough luck, wouldn't that free up a lot of police officers' times?
I think there's two ways of looking at this. First of all, you're right. I think there are a lot of more efficient ways of doing things, but I think policing is also about the skin-to-skin contact. People want to see their neighborhood officers, and I think the best thing you can do is create opportunities for contact. There's nothing worse than being at an accident site on a highway where you simply need to exchange information, and a police car comes along, looks at you, waves, and drives on. Can't be a worse public relations scenario than that. You're in a highway exchanging information, the officer goes off. I think we need to create opportunities for officers to stop and actually talk to people. But over the decades, police services in North America have wasted millions of dollars in trying to automate systems that are no more efficient today than they were a decade ago. And so I don't know how we remedy that issue, but I have seen endless cycles of automation, mechanization, computerization, analytics, predictive policing, all of this sort of stuff that's gone on repeatedly and has not improved things one iota.
What do you think of paid duty?
It's pay duty is really outside the purview of policing. So yes, these guys are police officers, and yes, they're being called to do these duties outside, whether it's a construction site or. I think it's a terrible public relations concept, because these officers on those duties, while under the supervision of that division, are often standing there without a hat or a coffee in their hand or on the phone or not really in the roadway, sitting in the car, doing a whole bunch of other things. The oversight is much less than when they're actually out there performing the duties as police officers. And I think it's very poor, especially at these times.
Just for the very few who may not know the term paid duty, an officer can take a private contract for a day or a period of time with a construction company or whomever to manage the traffic flow or the pedestrians in that area. You've got a point, they may not be as sharply turned out on that assignment as for their regular work. But here's another question. What is all that kit on a police officer's belt cost? The taser, the gun, the body camera, whatever it is you're normally wearing on average, what's all that stuff cost, and the uniform?
Well, it's not just the equipment. The equipment is expensive. Every piece of equipment a police officer carries goes through a rigorous assessment, trial period, approval process, certification, all that sort of stuff.
Now, Anil, remember, you're under oath. How much does it cost?
I don't know what the cost is. I don't know, but I mean, police equipment is a big part of police expenditure. Salaries is number one, and then equipment. So, all
right. Well, my little point was going to be, it's got to be thousands of dollars when you get a gun, taser, and what have you involved.
Yeah.
And those were taxpayers' dollars that bought all that and the uniform, and they are being used so the officer can make money privately. That's my small point, and you would think that a bylaw enforcement officer or someone else on the city payroll who wasn't making $100,000 a year could do that kind of work. Okay, any final thoughts, Anil, from you on where to save money on the defunding the police issue and on the current really image problems that police are having?
Look, I think policing is not just crime and law enforcement and public order and all of those things. But somebody puts on a uniform and is standing in public, they're symbols of society. They're symbols of our normative expectations of how we want to live, what our values are. So there's a far greater impact that a police officer has than just the contact. We need to look at policing from a much larger perspective. This is a very important conversation. Defunding is the wrong term for it. Unfortunately, that's the one that's going to stick for the next little while, but it presents a lot of opportunities for good police leaders to look at how we can do things better. Not just do more precision policing as opposed to targeted policing, not just rebottle old ideas in new bottles, but actually come up with some alternatives to things that have gone bad persistently.
Well, there's one place to start thinking about that, and that is in the new edition of your book, Mending Broken Fences Policing. Anil Anand, retired inspector, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.